Hello and welcome to the Renaissance English History Podcast. I'm your host, Heather Chesko. So today I'm going to talk to you about a very famous Tudor printer. His name was John Day. And so I just did an episode on printing and early books in Tudor England. So I wanted to talk a little bit more in depth about this one very famous guy, John Day. He is most remembered today because he printed the Acts and Monuments, which was John Fox's famous book that chronicled all of the Protestant martyrs that were burned under Mary I. But John Day also published books on astrology, on palmistry, sermons, medicine, mathematics, and navigation. He was also an innovator. He was the first to use Anglo-Saxon typography. He used new italic fonts, all kind of cool things with printing. And he was an entrepreneur and a businessman. So Day was born in about 1522. Almost nothing of his early life is known or of his parents is known. He was probably in London by 1540. His name was mentioned in a city deposition as being a former servant of the printer and physician Thomas Reynaud. So Day was in London by the early 1540s. He wanted to start a printing company, and printers like Day had a number of obstacles that they had to overcome. One of the biggest ones, was that until 1670, there was actually no paper mill in England. So paper had to be imported from the continent. There are a couple of theories as to why England never invested in a paper mill. One of the major theories is that the government actually didn't want to make paper too available and make printing too easy, because it would be harder to keep track of potentially seditious materials being printed if you had too much paper and it was too available. So the common plan for illegal materials was to have them printed on the continent and then smuggled back into England. In Day's time, printers were also bookshops. So he, in addition to being a printer, also had to be an entrepreneur and sell his books in the bookshop that was attached to their workshop. He did this, and he also had other shops throughout London that sold his less expensive works. So it seems that by his workshop, he had a shop that sold his very expensive works. And then he had several other shops throughout London where you could buy his cheaper works. So Day rose to the top of his profession during the reign of Edward VI, when there were restrictions on publishers that were relaxed, and a wave of pro-Protestant propaganda on behalf of the English Reformation was encouraged by the Protestant government. But then, of course, under Mary I, that all changed, and many Protestant printers left and went to the continent. But Day stayed in England. He continued to print Protestant literature in secret. For years, it was actually thought that he did leave and go to the continent to avoid persecution. But other evidence, typographical and other evidence, has convinced scholars that Day actually set up a clandestine press in premises that were kind of linked to William Cecil in Lincolnshire, and that he kept on printing Protestant works. He used the pseudonym Michael Wood. So there's Michael Wood pamphlets that include Protestant writings by Lady Jane Grey, John Hooper, and attacks on Mary and her advisors. On the 16th of October, 1554, a diarist, Henry Mason, wrote that Day was actually caught and sent to the Tower of London for printing, quote, naughty books. In the Book of Martyrs, Fox himself records statements made in prison to Day by the future martyr John Rogers, and they, quote, speak being then in prison to the printer of this present book, who then also was laid up for like cause of religion. So he apparently was in jail. But there was an exodus of foreign Protestant workers under Mary, and that was causing a shortage of printers. So he was actually released the next year, and he was allowed to go back to work, but only as a jobbing printer. He continued to produce works for Catholicism and for a Catholic printer. Of course, this was a big change from the Protestant stuff he did, but he also served as the official printer of the City of London for 2 years. So he was still doing okay. Under Elizabeth I, Day went back to his premises at Aldersgate, and he enjoyed the patronage of a lot of high-ranking nobles, including William Cecil, Robert Dudley, and Matthew Parker, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury. With the help of these connections, he was able to obtain a lucrative patent to print William Cunningham's cosmographical glass. And this was a really exciting first edition he printed in 1559 that used a new italic font and also a number of woodcuts, a large number of woodcuts. And that was used to illustrate the book. He actually paid for the production costs himself. He knew that the work was going to kind of make his reputation as a master printer, so he decided to pay for it all himself. And Day's patent to print Cunningham, this was his first one under Elizabeth, gave him exclusive rights to the work for life that were compiled at Day's expense and were not repugnant to Holy Scripture or the law. So this stipulation would be a really important part of his income for the rest of his life. He kept on printing things. He obtained a patent for the whole book of Psalms collected into English meter. This was a metrical psalter, and he also was guaranteed the right to print all psalms in meter with note. In other words, this would be psalms with music. Generally, the psalms had been learned by memory, but this business was popular and there was a rise in musical literacy during the period. Actually, I've talked about this before in my blog with Matthew Parker, worked with Thomas Tallis to create the Parker Psalter, and Tallis, the tunes for the Parker Psalter, which were a set of tunes that Thomas Tallis wrote for Matthew Parker to launch some of the English Psalms. So I'll put a link up to that too by this. So anyway, he was involved with that. And all of these patents were worth up to £500 per year. And then in 1563, he started his most famous work, Acts and Monuments, also called the Book of Martyrs. Day and Fox probably met through Cecil, and the two became collaborators. In fact, Fox probably even lived in Aldersgate with Day at his shop for a while during the production of the book. They were very close and collaborated on it together. So Day kept on printing things throughout the 1570s. At one point, the stationer's company started to feel a little bit like he was making too much money. He was actually having to go to court. There was piracy involved with some of his books that he had printed, and there were a lot of court cases that he was involved in. And he was starting to get sick. By 1582, his health began to really deteriorate quickly. He raced to complete another edition of Acts and Monuments in 1583, and then he died in 1584 in Essex. He had been married twice, and he had fathered 13 children in each marriage. So he had had 26 children. I don't know how he had time to do all that with all of this printing going on. His printer, his actual printer that he used, had a picture of a sleeper awakening with the motto, "Arise, for it is day," both a play on his name and an allusion to the new era of religious reform, in which, of course, he was a major figure. So he is largely responsible for many, many of the tracts, including the most famous Book of Martyrs. And he was known as the master printer of the English Reformation. So I hope you enjoyed this mini cast, and I will speak with you again soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Blow, northern wind, send who may be sweating. Blow, northern wind, blow, blow, blow. Ich hatte durch den Bauerbricht, dat soll is semlis und Sicht. Mens gevoel meiden of nicht, fern freit von in all this wolfliche one, blood and